Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that changed American dinner tables forever, and not in the way you'd expect. We're talking about TV dinners, those foil-wrapped frozen rectangles of mystery meat, instant mashed potatoes, and suspiciously bright peas that somehow convinced an entire nation this was progress. Not gourmet cuisine, not a home-cooked meal, just 3 compartments of lukewarm ambition and a side of aluminum poisoning. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe if you're enjoying this. Thanks so much to everyone who suggested this topic. You made this happen. And hey, we're now live on Spotify, so check the description for the link. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Somehow it's always 2 a.m. somewhere, probably microwaving something you'll regret. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable and maybe hide your instant ramen because we're about to judge our ancestors' food choices pretty hard. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered how we got here? How did Americans go from Sunday roasts and homemade apple pie to eating Salisbury steak out of a tray while watching I Love Lucy? Was it convenience or laziness? Did anyone actually enjoy these things, or were we all just pretending? What did TV dinners taste like when they first appeared? Like hope, like cardboard, or like both? Could you survive a week eating nothing but frozen dinners from the 1950s without losing your mind or your taste buds? Would you trade your grandmother's cooking for a foil-wrapped mystery meal? Or would you start a revolution over rubbery turkey? And now, congratulations! You've just woken up in post-World War II America. The year is 1953. Your kitchen has a brand new freezer, your living room has a television set, and somewhere in a factory in Omaha, a tray of frozen food is about to change your life forever. You don't know it yet, but dinner will never be the same. Good luck. Let's start at the beginning, before TV dinners existed, back when the idea of eating frozen food wasn't just unusual, it was suspicious. In the early 20th century, most Americans got their food fresh, from gardens, from local farms, from corner grocers who knew your name and your mother's recipe for pot roast. Refrigeration existed, sure, but home freezers? Those were rare, expensive, and mostly filled with ice cream if you were fancy. Then came Clarence Birdseye, a name that sounds like a villain from a Dickens novel, but was actually a guy who changed everything by flash freezing fish in the 1920s. He'd noticed that Inuit communities in Labrador preserved food by freezing it quickly in Arctic conditions, and he thought, what if I could do that commercially? So he did. And suddenly frozen peas weren't just possible, they were everywhere. Before Birdseye, freezing food was a disaster. Ice, crystals would form slowly, puncturing cell walls and turning your precious vegetables into mushy, flavourless garbage the moment you thawed them. It was like trying to preserve a tomato by hitting it with a hammer. But Birdseye figured out that if you froze food fast enough, really fast, like Arctic winter fast, the ice crystals stayed tiny, and the food kept its structure, flavour and nutrients. Well, most of them anyway. It wasn't perfect, but it was revolutionary. By the 1930s, Birdseye frozen foods were appearing in grocery stores across America, packed in waxed cardboard boxes and marketed as modern miracles of science. Housewives were skeptical. Fresh was king. Fresh meant quality, meant care, meant you actually loved your family enough to peel potatoes by hand. Frozen meant shortcuts, and shortcuts meant you were lazy, possibly morally suspect. But then World War II happened, and suddenly frozen food wasn't just convenient, it was patriotic. The military needed to feed troops overseas, and frozen food was lighter, lasted longer, and didn't spoil in transport. Companies like Birdseye ramped up production, and Americans at home got used to the idea that frozen didn't mean inferior. It just meant efficient. By the time the war ended, the frozen food industry had momentum. Grocery stores were installing freezer cases. Manufacturers were experimenting with everything: frozen orange juice, frozen pot pies, frozen vegetables in butter sauce, and crucially, American homes were getting freezers, not just little ice boxes, actual standalone freezers or refrigerator-freezer combos that could store weeks' worth of food. This was the dream of modernity. A cold box in your kitchen that meant you never had to shop every single day like some kind of peasant. But frozen food still had a problem. It wasn't a meal, it was ingredients. You still had to cook the peas, heat the pot pie, mix the orange juice. You still had to think, plan, and use multiple dishes. And America, freshly victorious, newly suburban, and extremely tired, wanted something even easier. They wanted dinner without effort. They wanted to eat while watching I Love Lucy without missing the punchline because they were stirring gravy. What they wanted, though they didn't know it yet, was a complete meal in a single disposable tray. They wanted the TV dinner, and in 1953 they were about to get it. If you want to understand how TV dinners took over America, you have to understand World War II, because wars don't just reshape borders, they reshape dinner plates. During the war, millions of American men shipped overseas, and millions of American women went to work in factories, building planes, assembling tanks, and generally keeping the country running while the boys were away. There wasn't time for 3-hour Sunday dinners anymore, not when you were working double shifts riveting bomber fuselages. So the food industry stepped up with a new promise: convenience. The military needed food that could travel thousands of miles, survive months in storage, and still be edible when it reached soldiers in the Pacific or Europe. Enter industrial food science. Companies figured out how to dehydrate eggs, condense milk, freeze meat, and pack everything into cans or boxes that could withstand being dropped from planes or tossed into the back of a jeep. It wasn't gourmet, but it worked. Soldiers ate Spam, powdered potatoes, canned beans, and something called K-rations that tasted like cardboard soaked in regret, but kept you alive, which was really the main goal. Back home, rationing changed everything. Sugar, butter, meat, coffee, all limited. Housewives were encouraged to be creative, which is a polite way of saying make dinner out of nothing and don't complain. Government propaganda posters urged women to grow victory gardens, can their own vegetables, and stretch meals with cheap fillers like pasta and bread. Cooking wasn't just domestic labour anymore, it was a patriotic duty. Every meal you didn't waste was a meal that could go to a soldier. No pressure. But here's the thing, once the war ended, nobody wanted to go back. Women had tasted independence, income, and a life beyond the kitchen. They didn't want to spend hours every day chopping, stirring, and baking just to put food on the table. And returning soldiers. They'd gotten used to food that came pre-prepared, pre-portioned, and ready to eat. Why go backward? Why spend all day cooking when science had clearly figured out faster ways? The food industry saw the opportunity and pounced. If people wanted convenient, they'd get convenient, frozen, canned, instant, dehydrated, pre-mixed, pre-seasoned, pre-everything. Companies that had been making military rations pivoted to civilian markets. Instant coffee, which had been perfected for soldiers, became a grocery store staple. Canned soups went from wartime necessity to weeknight dinner solution. Frozen vegetables, once a novelty, were now everywhere, marketed as modern, scientific, and just as good as fresh. Spoiler, they weren't, but people wanted to believe. And then there was the deeper shift. America was suburbanizing. Families were moving out of cities into cookie-cutter neighborhoods with lawns, carports, and shiny new kitchens. These kitchens had electric stoves, refrigerators, and eventually freezers. They were designed for efficiency, not tradition. The message was clear. The future was fast, clean, and required minimal effort. Cooking from scratch was old-fashioned. Modern families had better things to do, like watch television, which was quickly becoming the centre of American life. The stage was set. All someone needed to do was invent a meal you could heat up and eat in front of the TV without missing a single moment of the honeymooners. That someone was coming. And so was the TV dinner. Here's where TV dinners get truly absurd. They were invented because someone had way too much. Turkey. Not a little too much. We're talking 260 tons of frozen turkey sitting in refrigerated rail cars with nowhere to go. It was 1953, and Swanson, a company known for chicken pot pies and frozen poultry, had massively overestimated how much turkey Americans would eat after Thanksgiving. Turns out even Americans have limits. So there sat this mountain of turkey, slowly crystallizing in storage, costing money and threatening to become the most expensive mistake in poultry history. Swanson executives were panicking. They'd ordered enough turkey to feed a small army, expecting post-holiday sales to skyrocket. But once Thanksgiving passed, Americans collectively looked at their leftover turkey sandwiches and said, "Nope, we're done." The problem wasn't just the turkey itself, it was the logistics. Frozen food had to stay frozen, which meant those rail cars were running refrigeration units around the clock, burning fuel and racking up costs. Every day the turkey sat there was another day of losses. Something had to be done, and fast. Enter Jerry Thomas, a Swanson salesman who would later claim credit for inventing the TV dinner, though others disputed this. Regardless of who deserves the glory, Thomas was tasked with solving the turkey crisis, and he came back with an idea so simple it was almost stupid. What if we just sold people a complete frozen meal in a tray? Not just turkey, turkey with sides, all in one package, ready to heat and eat. No prep, no cleanup, no thinking required. Just pop it in the oven and you're done. It was inspired by airline meals, those little compartmentalized trays passengers got on flights. If it worked at 30,000 feet, why not at home? The beauty of the idea was that it solved multiple problems at once. First, it used up the turkey. Second, it created a product that didn't exist yet, a fully prepared, frozen, multi-course meal. Third, it tapped into the growing American obsession with convenience and television. People wanted easy. This was easy wrapped in aluminum foil. But there was risk. Frozen meals weren't new, but a complete dinner in a tray? That was experimental. Would people actually buy it? Would they trust that reheated turkey, instant mashed potatoes and frozen peas could be a real meal? And would they pay for it? The first TV dinners were priced at 98 cents, which wasn't cheap for the 1950s. That's roughly $10 today, for a single meal. In a disposable tray. It was a gamble. Swanson bet on America's laziness, America's love of modern convenience. And they were right. The company produced 5,000 TV dinners as a test run, hoping to quietly get rid of the turkey surplus. Instead, they sold over 10 million units in the first year. 10 million. Americans didn't just accept the TV dinner, they embraced it like a long-lost friend who promised to do all the cooking from now on. That turkey surplus, gone in months, and in its place, an entirely new way of eating. One that would define American food culture for decades to come and make us all question what we'd sacrificed in the name of convenience. TV dinners didn't just appear out of thin air, they were designed, and the man behind the design was Jerry Thomas, a Swanson salesman with a problem to solve and a stroke of marketing genius. Thomas had been sent to figure out what to do with that infamous turkey surplus, and during a business trip he noticed airline meal trays. Compact, compartmentalized, efficient. Why not, he thought, do the same thing for home? It was brilliant in its simplicity. Thomas didn't invent frozen food, or even the concept of a pre-made meal, but he understood something crucial. Presentation mattered. People needed to see the meal as complete, as legitimate, as something worth buying. A tray divided into sections did that. It gave the meal structure, made it look intentional rather than thrown together. The largest compartment held the turkey. A smaller one held the sweet potatoes, another held the peas, and in the corner a little section for dessert, usually apple cobbler or some other brown, vaguely sweet substance. It was dinner theatre on aluminum, but designing the tray wasn't as simple as grabbing any old aluminum and stamping it into shape. The compartments had to be deep enough to hold food, but shallow enough to heat evenly in an oven. The material had to withstand high temperatures without warping, leaching chemicals, or catching fire. And it had to be cheap, dirt cheap, because the whole point was convenience, and convenience only worked if it was affordable. Swanson's engineers spent weeks testing prototypes, adjusting depths, tweaking sizes, making sure the peas didn't overflow into the potatoes and ruin the aesthetic. The result was an aluminum tray roughly 9 by 12 inches, divided into 3 or 4 sections depending on the meal. It was covered with a thin aluminum foil lid that you were supposed to leave on during cooking. Though let's be honest, half of America ignored that instruction and wondered why their turkey came out dry as a bone. The tray itself became iconic, so iconic that even today, when you say TV dinner, people instantly picture that compartmentalized rectangle, even if modern frozen meals come in plastic or microwavable containers. Thomas also understood branding. He pushed for the name TV dinner and insisted the packaging look like a television set. The box featured a retro TV screen showcasing the meal inside, reinforcing the connection between eating and watching television. It wasn't subtle, but it didn't need to be. This was 1953, and subtlety wasn't exactly a cultural priority. The message was clear. This meal is modern, this meal is fun, this meal belongs in front of your TV. Some historians argue that Thomas wasn't solely responsible, that the idea emerged from a team of Swanson employees brainstorming solutions. And you know what? That's probably true. Corporations love to create hero narratives, lone inventors saving the day, but reality is usually messier. Still, Thomas became the face of the TV dinner, the guy who told the story in interviews for decades, and whether he invented it or not, he certainly sold it. And that's what mattered. Because the TV dinner wasn't just a product, it was a pitch, a promise that American life could be easier, faster, and more entertaining. All you had to do was heat it up and sit down. Dinner was served, no effort required, and Jerry Thomas made sure you knew it. Let's talk about the name, because TV dinner wasn't an accident. It was marketing genius wrapped in aluminum foil. In 1953, television was exploding across America. Families who'd never owned a TV were suddenly gathering around tiny black and white screens every night, watching The Honeymooners, Dragnet, and I Love Lucy like it was a religious experience. The TV wasn't just furniture, it was the new hearth, the centre of the home. Before television, families ate dinner at the table. It was a ritual. You set the table, you sat down together, you talked about your day, you argued about politics or whose turn it was to wash dishes. Meals were communal, face-to-face, and often the only time the whole family was in one place. But then television arrived, and suddenly there was something more interesting than conversation. Entertainment. Right in your living room, every single night. Why sit at a boring table when you could watch Lucy stuff chocolates into her mouth on a conveyor belt? Swanson recognized this shift immediately. Americans were rearranging their lives around TV schedules. Dinner was no longer sacred. It was an inconvenience that interrupted Gunsmoke. People wanted to eat while they watched, but traditional meals required plates, silverware, napkins, and the eternal risk of spilling gravy on the couch. The TV dinner solved this. It was compact, self-contained, and designed to be eaten from the tray itself. No mess, no fuss, No missing the punchline because you were cutting your chicken. The name TV dinner made the connection explicit. This wasn't just food. It was food designed for a new way of living, a way that revolved around the television. Swanson even designed the packaging to look like a TV set, complete with a retro screen showcasing the meal inside. It was shameless, obvious, and absolutely effective. The name told you exactly what the product was for, watching TV. It wasn't convenient frozen meal or quick family dinner. It was TV dinner, and that was all you needed to know. Critics at the time worried that TV dinners would destroy family meals, and honestly, they weren't wrong. The dining table, once the centre of family life, was suddenly optional. You could eat on the couch, in your pyjamas, with your eyes glued to the screen, and your fork mechanically shoveling food into your mouth. Conversation. Who needs it when you've got Lucille Ball? Connection? There's a connection. It's called coaxial cable. The TV dinner didn't just change what we ate. It changed where and how we ate. It turned meals into background noise, something you did while doing something else. But here's the thing. People loved it. The TV dinner was freedom. Freedom from cooking, from cleaning, from having to perform the nightly ritual of family togetherness, when honestly, you were exhausted and just wanted to zone out for 30 minutes. The name TV dinner promised escape, ease and entertainment, all for 98 cents. And Americans, tired from work, raising kids and trying to keep up with the Joneses, said yes. Yes to convenience. Yes to modernity. Yes to eating reconstituted turkey while watching a man in a cowboy hat shoot bad guys on a flickering screen. The name stuck. Even decades later, long after other brands entered the market and the Swanson monopoly faded, people still called them TV dinners. It wasn't just branding, it was cultural shorthand for a whole way of life. A life where dinner didn't require effort and TV didn't require an invitation. You just sat down, peeled back the foil, and let modern America do the rest. So what exactly was in that first Swanson TV dinner? Let's open the foil and take a look. Though, honestly, you might wish we hadn't. The original 1953 TV dinner came in a rectangular aluminum tray divided into 3 compartments, each holding a different component of what Swanson optimistically called a complete meal. In the larger section, turkey, specifically sliced turkey in gravy, the kind that looked like it had been processed through a machine that had forgotten what a real turkey looked like. The turkey was the star, the reason this whole thing existed in the first place. Remember, Swanson had a surplus to unload, and they weren't about to waste it on anything fancy, so they took pre-cooked turkey, sliced it thin, doused it in gravy to keep it from drying out completely, and plopped it into the tray. The gravy was thick, gluey, and tasted like someone had dissolved a bouillon cube in wallpaper paste. But it served a purpose: moisture. Without it, the turkey would have turned into leather during reheating. With it, the turkey merely turned into moist leather. Progress. Next compartment. Sweet potatoes. Not mashed, not roasted, just sweet potatoes whipped into an orange slurry and deposited into the tray like institutional cafeteria food. They were cloyingly sweet, vaguely mushy, and had a texture that made you question whether they'd ever been an actual vegetable. Some versions included a pat of margarine or a sprinkle of brown sugar on top, which didn't help. It just made the whole thing taste like sugary glue. But Americans in the 1950s loved sweet potatoes, especially with turkey, so Swanson included them. Tradition, even when it tasted terrible. Third compartment, peas. Oh, the peas. Those sad, shriveled, unnaturally green. Peas that looked like they'd been freeze-dried, rehydrated, refrozen, and then forgotten in a warehouse for 6 months. They were mealy, flavourless, and had the texture of tiny wet rubber balls. But they were vegetables technically, which meant the meal could be marketed as balanced. Never mind that the peas had lost most of their nutritional value through processing and freezing. They were green. That counted. And finally, in the smallest compartment, dessert. The original TV dinner featured apple cobbler, a brown gelatinous mass that was supposed to evoke homemade comfort, but instead evoked regret. It was sweet, sure, but in the way that chemicals are sweet, artificial, cloying, with an aftertaste that lingered long after you'd finished. The crust was soggy, the apples were mushy, and the whole thing had the consistency of baby food. But it was dessert, and dessert meant the meal was fancy, complete, worthy of your 98 cents. That was it. Turkey, sweet potatoes, peas, and cobbler. No salad, no bread, no variety. Just 4 components reheated in an oven for 25 minutes until they reached the culinary sweet spot between lukewarm and scalding, with no in-between. The portions were small. This was 1953, and portion sizes hadn't ballooned into American excess yet. A single TV dinner was supposed to be enough for one person, though many people found themselves still hungry afterward and ended up raiding the fridge for something, anything, to fill the void. So that was the first TV dinner, a triumph of convenience, a disaster of flavour, and a symbol of everything modern America was becoming. Fast, efficient, and just good enough to get by. You didn't eat it because it was delicious. You ate it because it was there. It was easy. And Walter Cronkite was about to deliver the evening news. Priorities. Ever wonder how those perfectly portioned frozen meals were assembled? The process was part assembly line, part science experiment, and entirely industrial. In the 1950s, Swanson's factories operated like military operations, fast, efficient, and with zero room for anyone who cared about flavour. The turkey, already cooked and cooled, would arrive at the factory in massive batches. Workers would slice it into uniform pieces because apparently every American needed exactly 5 ounces of turkey, no more, no less. The sliced turkey was then placed onto conveyor belts, where it moved through the factory like a reluctant passenger on the world's saddest ride. First stop, the gravy station. Workers ladled thick, gelatinous gravy over the turkey slices, ensuring each piece was sufficiently coated. The gravy wasn't made fresh. It came from enormous vats where it had been simmering, thickening, and gradually losing any connection to actual poultry. It was shelf-stable, preservative-loaded, and designed to survive freezing, shipping, and reheating without separating or curdling. Flavour was optional. Next, the trays. Themselves moved down the line. Aluminum trays were stamped out by machines, formed into their distinctive compartmentalised shape, and lined up in rows. Workers stationed along the line would spoon pre-measured portions of food into each section. Sweet potatoes in one compartment, peas in another, turkey in the main section, dessert in the smallest. It was rhythmic, repetitive work. Scoop, 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 move to the next tray, repeat 5,000 times a day. Efficiency was everything. No one stopped to admire the artistry of a well-placed pea. Once filled, the trays moved to the covering station, where sheets of aluminum foil were pressed over the top and crimped around the edges. This wasn't just packaging, it was engineering. The foil had to seal tightly enough to prevent freezer burn, but not so tightly that home cooks couldn't peel it back without ripping it to shreds and launching peas across the kitchen. The balance was delicate, and Swanson's engineers spent considerable time perfecting it, because nothing ruins a modern convenience meal faster than packaging that fights back. After sealing, the trays entered the flash-freezing tunnel. This was the magic moment, the point where fresh food became frozen product. Conveyor belts carried the meals through massive freezers, where temperatures dropped to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The goal was to freeze the food as quickly as possible, preventing large ice crystals from forming and turning the turkey into mush. Flash freezing preserved texture, sort of, and locked in freshness. Or at least locked in whatever freshness had survived the industrial cooking, slicing and gravy dousing process. Once frozen solid, the trays were packaged into those iconic TV-shaped boxes, complete with colourful graphics showing the meal inside. The boxes were stacked, loaded onto refrigerated trucks, and shipped to grocery stores across America. From factory to freezer aisle, the whole process took less than a day. It was efficient, modern, and completely disconnected from anything resembling home cooking. And the workers? They stood on cold factory floors for hours, wearing hairnets and gloves, scooping potatoes and ladling gravy in assembly line monotony. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady. And in post-war America, steady work mattered. Swanson employed hundreds of people in their facilities, and those people helped churn out millions of TV dinners a year. They weren't chefs. They weren't artisans. They were assemblers, building meals the same way Ford built cars, one piece at a time, as fast as possible, without ever stopping to ask if maybe, just maybe, this was a terrible idea. Let's talk about the tray itself, because that aluminum compartment wasn't just packaging, it was innovation. Before TV dinners, frozen food came in cardboard boxes or wax paper wrapping. You had to transfer it to pots and pans, which meant dishes, which meant work. But the TV dinner tray changed everything. You could cook it, eat from it, and throw it away without washing a single dish. The aluminum tray was lightweight, durable, and conducted heat efficiently, which meant your turkey reheated relatively evenly, assuming you followed the instructions, which again, almost no one did. The material could withstand oven temperatures without warping or melting, and it was cheap enough to be disposable. This was crucial. The entire appeal of the TV dinner was convenience, and washing a tray defeated the purpose. You were supposed to eat your meal, toss the tray in the trash, and go back to watching television like a modern American should. But aluminum trays weren't perfect. For one, they created waste, lots of waste. Every TV dinner generated a disposable tray, a cardboard box, and a sheet of foil. Multiply that by millions of meals sold every year, and you've got a serious trash problem. But this was the 1950s, and environmental consciousness wasn't exactly a national priority. America was booming, suburbs were sprawling, and garbage was just something you put on the curb for someone else to deal with. The trays also had quirks. If you weren't careful, the edges could be sharp, slicing your finger as you peeled back the foil. The compartment sometimes leaked, allowing gravy to seep into the dessert or peas to migrate into the potatoes. And if you forgot to remove the foil completely before putting the tray in the oven, well, some people learned the hard way that aluminum, foil and oven heating elements don't always get along. Small kitchen fires were not uncommon. Still, the tray was a marvel of industrial design. It solved problems people didn't even know they had. You didn't need serving dishes, dinner plates, or even silverware if you were feeling particularly lazy. Just grab a fork and eat straight from the tray. Some families did exactly that, balancing trays on their laps while watching Ed Sullivan or Walter Cronkite. It wasn't elegant, but it was efficient, and efficiency was the entire point. The compartmentalized design also had a psychological appeal. Everything had its place. The turkey didn't touch the peas. The dessert stayed separate. For people who liked order, who didn't want their flavors mixing, the tray was perfect. It was like a bento box for Americans who'd never heard of bento boxes. Everything organized, portioned, controlled. Over time, the aluminum tray became iconic. When people think of TV dinners, they think of that tray, the metallic sheen, the stamped compartments, the foil cover reflecting overhead kitchen lights. It's been parodied, referenced, and reproduced in pop culture for decades. Even now, With most frozen meals packaged in plastic or microwavable containers, the aluminum tray remains the symbol of mid-century convenience culture. But here's the kicker. The tray also represented something darker. It was disposable, like so much of post-war American culture. Use it once, throw it away, buy another. It was the opposite of the heirloom china your grandmother passed down, the opposite of care and tradition. The TV dinner tray was designed to be forgotten the moment you tossed it in the trash, and in that way, it was the perfect symbol for a culture that was moving fast, consuming more, and leaving behind a trail of aluminum waste that would sit in landfills for decades, quietly reminding us of the price of convenience. Here's the thing about TV dinners. They came with instructions, very specific instructions, printed right on the box in bold letters. Preheat oven to 425 degrees Fahrenheit. Remove dinner from outer carton. Do not remove foil covering. Place tray on center rack. Heat for 25 minutes. Simple, right? Except nobody, and I mean nobody, followed them correctly. First, there was the preheating issue. Preheating an oven takes time, and time was exactly what people were trying to avoid by buying a TV dinner in the first place. So most people just cranked the oven to 425, tossed the tray in immediately and hoped for the best. This meant the food heated unevenly. The edges would be scalding while the center remained frozen solid, creating a delightful culinary experience where you'd burn your tongue on gravy and chip a tooth on ice crystal peas in the same bite. Then there was the foil covering. The instructions explicitly said not to remove it, but naturally people did anyway. They figured removing the foil would help the food heat faster or brown better. Instead, it just dried everything out. The turkey, already borderline jerky, would emerge from the oven resembling shoe leather. The sweet potatoes would form a crusty skin. The peas would shrivel into tiny desiccated pellets. But people kept doing it because reading instructions is for suckers and communists. Even if you left the foil on, things could go wrong. Some people forgot to vent it, trapping steam inside and turning the dinner into a soggy, waterlogged mess. Others poked too many holes and released all the moisture, leading back to the dried-out desert of overcooked sadness. There was a Goldilocks zone of foil perfection, and finding it required more precision than most home cooks were willing to invest in a 98-cent meal. And then there was the timing. 25 minutes sounds straightforward, but ovens varied wildly in the 1950s. Some ran hot, some ran cold, and most weren't calibrated at all. So 25 minutes was more of a suggestion, a vague guideline subject to interpretation, and the whims of your particular appliance. Some dinners came out lukewarm, others emerged charred and smoking. You just never knew. People also ignored the placement instructions. Center rack meant center rack, not top rack where everything would burn, not bottom rack where nothing would cook. But Americans are rebels, and we do not take kindly to being told where to place our food in our own ovens. So trays ended up everywhere, heating unevenly, burning on one side, frozen on the other, creating meals that somehow managed to be both undercooked and overcooked simultaneously. The result? A generation of Americans who associated TV dinners not with convenience but with culinary disappointment. You'd pull the tray out after the allotted time, peel back the foil and stare down at a meal that looked nothing like the picture on the box. The turkey was dry, the potatoes were gluey, the peas had somehow multiplied and conquered half the tray. And the dessert? Let's not even talk about the dessert. It was molten lava or frozen solid, no middle ground. But here's the thing, people kept buying them anyway. Because even a mediocre TV dinner was easier than cooking. Even burned turkey was faster than roasting a chicken. Even dried out peas were simpler than steaming fresh vegetables. The instructions didn't matter. What mattered was speed, convenience, and the ability to eat dinner without missing a single moment of gun smoke. And if that meant occasionally biting into something that tasted like aluminum-flavoured disappointment, Well, that was the price of progress. Let's be brutally honest. TV dinners tasted like what they were: reheated industrial food designed for efficiency, not enjoyment. The turkey was rubbery, the gravy gelatinous, the potatoes gluey, and the peas. Those peas had seen things, terrible things, and they tasted like regret mixed with salt and food dye number 5. The turkey was perhaps the most disappointing element. You expected turkey to taste like Thanksgiving, like warmth and family and carved slices from a golden roasted bird. Instead, you got slabs of processed poultry that had been cooked, frozen, shipped, stored, reheated, and thoroughly punished by the journey. The texture was wrong, too firm, too uniform, with none of the fibrous tenderness of real roasted meat. It tasted vaguely of turkey, the way a turkey-scented candle might taste if you were unfortunate enough to eat it. And the gravy. Oh, the gravy. It was supposed to be the saviour, the element that added moisture and flavour. But Swanson's gravy was thick as cement, salty as seawater, and had a strange chemical aftertaste that lingered long after the meal was finished. You could tell it had been thickened with cornstarch or some other industrial agent, because it had that gluey consistency that coated your mouth and refused to leave. Washing it down with water didn't help. You just tasted salty water with a gravy chaser. The sweet potatoes were cloyingly sweet, like someone had dumped an entire bag of sugar into mashed squash and called it a vegetable. They were mushy, textureless, and had that institutional cafeteria vibe that made you wonder if they'd been sitting in a steam tray for 6 hours before being frozen. There was no natural sweetness, no hint of actual sweet potato, just sugar, margarine, and orange dye pretending to be food. The peas were the worst. Small, hard, mealy little spheres that tasted like nothing except the faint metallic tang of the can or freezer they'd lived in. They weren't tender, they weren't fresh, they were survival rations masquerading as vegetables. You chewed them dutifully because they were there and because throwing them away felt wasteful, but you didn't enjoy them. No one enjoyed the peas, and the dessert apple cobbler, cherry crisp, or some other fruity brown sludge was aggressively mediocre. It was sweet, but not pleasantly so. The fruit filling was gelatinous, and tasted more of high fructose corn syrup than apples or cherries. The crust, if you could call it that, was soggy and flavourless, disintegrating the moment your fork touched it. It was dessert in name only, a participation trophy for making it through the rest of the meal. But here's the strange part. People didn't hate them. Sure, no one claimed TV dinners were delicious. No one raved about the flavour. But they ate them anyway, week after week, year after year, because taste wasn't the point. The point was convenience. The point was being able to sit down in front of the TV at 6:30, fork in hand, and eat dinner without thinking, without cooking, without cleaning. The point was modern life, and modern life, as it turned out, tasted like reconstituted turkey and freezer-burned peas. Not great, but good enough. And in 1953 America, good enough was a revolution. TV dinners didn't sell themselves, advertising sold them, and boy, did Madison Avenue go all in. The commercials were slick, optimistic, and completely divorced from reality. They showed smiling families gathered around the television, forks in hand, enjoying their modern meals with a kind of joy usually reserved for winning the lottery. The father, home from work in his suit and tie, beaming at his perfectly coiffed wife. The children, clean and well-behaved, praising the delicious food. Everyone laughing, everyone happy, everyone thrilled to be eating reheated turkey from an aluminum tray. It was American dreaming at its finest, or its most delusional, depending on your perspective. The genius of TV dinner advertising was that it never actually focused on the food, because if you looked too closely at that grey turkey or those suspiciously green peas, you'd start asking questions. Instead, the ads sold lifestyle, convenience, and modernity. They sold the idea that you were living in the future. One classic Swanson commercial showed a woman effortlessly gliding through her evening. No pots, no pans, no stress. Just pop the dinner in the oven and suddenly you're free to do more important things, like watching television or applying another coat of lipstick. The tagline might as well have been, "Why cook when you can pretend you cooked?" And the packaging itself was advertising gold. That colourful box with the image of a perfectly browned turkey, steaming vegetables and fluffy mashed potatoes looked nothing like the actual product inside, but that didn't matter. The box was aspirational. It showed you what dinner could be in your imagination, not what it actually was in your oven. It's the same psychological trick fast food uses today. The burger in the photo versus the sad, flattened thing in the wrapper. We knew we were being lied to, but we wanted to believe. TV dinner ads also leaned heavily into gender roles. Women were shown being liberated from the kitchen, finally free to relax and enjoy family time instead of slaving over a hot stove. But here's the catch. They were still responsible for feeding the family. The message wasn't men should cook too. It was women should cook faster. TV dinners didn't redistribute domestic labour. They just made it more efficient. And the ads made sure women felt modern and progressive for choosing convenience, even though they were still doing all the work, just with more aluminum foil involved. Then there were the endorsements. Celebrities, athletes, and even cartoon characters got in on the game. If a famous person ate TV dinners, well, they must be good, right? Wrong! Those celebrities were cashing checks and probably eating steak at fancy restaurants afterward. But the illusion worked. People bought it, literally. At the height of TV dinner mania in the 1960s, Swanson was selling over 25 million dinners a year, and competitors were raking in millions more. The advertising didn't just sell a product, it sold a world view. That modern life should be fast, easy, and require minimal effort. That tradition could be sacrificed for convenience without consequence. That sitting in front of a TV with a tray of reheated food was just as valid as gathering round a table for a home-cooked meal. It was a cultural shift wrapped in foil and sold with a smile, and America ate it up, one compartmentalized meal at a time. One of the biggest selling points of TV dinners was aimed squarely at women, specifically housewives, who were expected to cook 3 meals a day, clean the house, raise the children, and somehow still look perfect when their husbands came home. TV dinners promised liberation. They were marketed as a tool of freedom, a way to escape the endless drudgery of meal preparation. Finally, women could have time for themselves, or at least that's what the commercials claimed. In reality, TV dinners didn't free women from domestic labour, they just rebranded it as modern efficiency. Let's talk about what life was like for women in the 1950s, because context matters. Post-World War II, America saw millions of women pushed out of factory jobs and back into homes. During the war, they'd welded ships, assembled airplanes, and kept the economy running. But once the men returned, society decided women belonged in kitchens again, wearing aprons and baking casseroles. The 1950s housewife was an ideal, not a reality. A woman who was cheerful, tireless, and devoted entirely to her family's comfort. And cooking was the cornerstone of that identity. Preparing meals in the 1950s was labour-intensive. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner all required planning, shopping, chopping, cooking, and cleaning. There were no microwaves, no dishwashers in most homes, and definitely no takeout apps. If your family wanted to eat, you made it happen every single day without complaint. And if the food wasn't perfect, well, that reflected poorly on you as a woman, as a wife, as a mother. The pressure was relentless. So when TV dinners arrived, promising to cut meal prep time down to minutes, it sounded like a miracle. The advertising spoke directly to exhausted women. Wouldn't you like more time with your family? Wouldn't you like to relax for once? Wouldn't you like to watch TV instead of standing over a stove? The answer, obviously, was yes. TV dinners were framed as a form of self-care, a way to reclaim a few precious minutes in a day that demanded everything. But here's the uncomfortable truth. TV dinners didn't actually change the division of labour in the home. Women were still responsible for feeding the family. They still had to remember to buy the dinners, store them, heat them, and serve them. The labour was simplified, but it wasn't eliminated. And men? They still sat down, ate, and expected dinner to appear without lifting a finger. TV dinners didn't challenge traditional gender roles, they just made them more efficient. There was also a darker side to this convenience narrative. By the 1960s, as more women began entering the workforce out of necessity or desire, TV dinners became less about leisure and more about survival. Working mothers were juggling jobs and housework, and frozen dinners became a way to feed the family when there simply wasn't time to cook from scratch. But instead of society acknowledging that women were doing double duty, the message became, you can have it all if you just buy the right products. TV dinners were sold as empowerment, but they were really just another way to keep women responsible for everything while pretending progress had been made. In the end, TV dinners didn't liberate women. They just changed the tools of their labour. The kitchen was still their domain. Dinner was still their job. The only difference was that now it came in a foil tray, and somehow that was supposed to feel like freedom. Before TV dinners, family meals were sacred. You sat down together at the table, no television, no distractions, and you ate what someone had spent hours preparing. Conversation happened. Eye contact happened. Arguments about politics and whose turn it was to do the dishes happened. It wasn't always peaceful, but it was communal. Dinner was the one time of day when everyone gathered, even if they didn't particularly want to. TV dinners shattered that ritual, replacing it with something fundamentally different. Eating in front of a screen, alone together, silently consuming food and entertainment in equal measure. The shift didn't happen overnight. At first, TV dinners were marketed as occasional conveniences, something for busy weeknights or when mum was too tired to cook. But convenience is seductive. Once families realised they could skip the hassle of setting the table, cooking multiple dishes, and sitting through awkward conversations, it became harder to go back. Why bother with formality when you could just grab a tray, plop down on the couch, and watch Bonanza in peace? The design of the TV dinner itself encouraged this shift. It was individual, self-contained, and portable. Unlike a roast or a casserole that required everyone to gather and serve themselves, TV dinners could be heated and eaten separately. Each family member could have their own tray, their own meal, their own space. There was no need to pass dishes, share food, or even sit near each other. Dinner became a solitary experience happening simultaneously in the same room, and then there was the television, the real centerpiece of the modern home. By the mid-1950s, over half of American households owned a TV, and by the 1960s, that number was over 90%. The TV wasn't just entertainment, it was a magnetic force, pulling everyone toward it. Families planned their evenings around television schedules. Missing an episode of your favourite show was unthinkable, so when TV dinners offered a way to eat and watch at the same time, it wasn't just convenient, it was necessary. But something was lost in the process. Dinner table conversations, the place where children learned to articulate thoughts, where parents shared their days, where families worked through conflicts, began to disappear. Silence replaced dialogue. The TV filled the void, providing voices and stories that weren't your own. Families stopped asking, "How was your day?" because they were too busy watching someone else's day unfold on screen. Nutritionists and sociologists started sounding alarms by the 1970s. Studies showed that families who ate together without distractions had stronger relationships, better communication, and even healthier eating habits. Children who sat down for regular family meals performed better in school, had fewer behavioural issues, and were less likely to engage in risky behaviours. But by then, the damage was done. TV dinners had normalised the idea that meals didn't need to be communal. They could be quick, individual, and efficient. Today, we're living with the consequences. The modern dinner table, if it exists at all, is often cluttered with phones, tablets, and distractions. Families eat on different schedules, in different rooms, consuming different meals. TV dinners didn't create this fragmentation alone, but they were the first crack in the foundation. They proved that convenience could replace connection, that speed could replace ritual, and that a foil tray could replace a shared experience. And once we learned that lesson, there was no unlearning it. Once Swanson proved that Americans would buy frozen meals in trays, the floodgates opened. Turkey was just the beginning. Soon, TV dinners came in every variety. Fried chicken, Salisbury steak, meatloaf, fish sticks, ham, roast beef, and even breakfast versions with eggs, sausage and pancakes that somehow tasted like cardboard mixed with syrup. If it could be cooked, frozen, and compartmentalized, someone was turning it into a TV dinner. The food industry had discovered a gold mine, and they weren't about to stop at poultry. The expansion happened fast. By the late 1950s, Swanson's competitors, Banquet, Morton, and others, were flooding grocery store freezers with their own versions. Each brand tried to differentiate itself: bigger portions, fancier sides, new proteins. Morton introduced the three-course dinner, which included a dessert section with something resembling brownies or cobbler, though resembling is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Banquet went budget, offering cheaper meals that somehow tasted even worse than Swanson's, which was an achievement in itself. And it wasn't just dinner anymore. TV dinners expanded into every meal. Breakfast versions featured scrambled eggs, sausage links, hash browns, and tiny pancakes that reheated into rubbery discs. Lunch versions included sandwiches, soups, and snack packs that were basically Lunchables before Lunchables existed. There were even dessert TV dinners, entire trays dedicated to cakes, pies, and puddings for people who wanted their sugar fix without the effort of baking. The variety explosion also meant ethnic and international options, though international is a generous term. Companies introduced Italian dinners with spaghetti and meatballs that bore no resemblance to anything Italy would recognize. Mexican dinners featured questionable enchiladas and refried beans that looked like brown paste. Chinese dinners included sweet and sour chicken, with neon red sauce and fried rice that tasted like salted cardboard. These meals weren't authentic. They were vague approximations designed for Americans who'd never tasted the real thing, and probably never would. But here's the thing. People bought them. Because TV dinners weren't about authenticity or quality, they were about novelty and convenience. Trying a Polynesian TV dinner with teriyaki chicken and pineapple was exotic, even if it tasted like someone had dumped a can of fruit cocktail onto leftover chicken. It was dinner and entertainment in one tray. The expansion also catered to specific demographics. Hungry Man dinners launched in the 1970s, targeting men who supposedly needed bigger portions, because apparently masculinity required 16 ounces of Salisbury steak and an extra helping of mashed potatoes. These dinners were massive, calorie-dense, and marketed with imagery of rugged men doing manly things like chopping wood or grilling steaks, even though they were eating microwaved food like everyone else. For kids, there were kid cuisine dinners with fun shapes, bright colours, and built-in desserts. These trays featured chicken nuggets shaped like dinosaurs, mac and cheese that glowed unnaturally orange, and pudding cups that doubled as toys. The goal was to make frozen dinners appealing to children, and it worked. Kids loved them. parents tolerated them, and nutritionists quietly wept into their vegetables. By the 1980s, the TV dinner aisle was a chaotic carnival of options. You could find anything from Thanksgiving turkey dinners to BQ ribs to shrimp scampi to vegetarian lasagna. The variety was overwhelming, the quality questionable, and the convenience undeniable. TV dinners had evolved from a turkey surplus solution into a full-fledged food category, and there was no turning back. Swanson wasn't alone for long. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, competitors smelled money and freezer burn and jumped into the frozen dinner game. Banquet launched cheaper alternatives, undercutting Swanson's prices with meals that were somehow even more depressing. Morton followed with their own versions, adding desserts to sweeten the deal, literally. But the real game-changer came in 1973 when Swanson itself launched Hungry Man, a line of supersized TV dinners aimed squarely at men who apparently needed twice as much food to function. Hungry Man dinners were absurd. They came in massive trays, packed with obscene portions, a pound of fried chicken, a mountain of mashed potatoes, corn, gravy, and a brownie big enough to cause a sugar coma. The packaging featured images of lumberjacks, football players, and other aggressively masculine figures, as if eating a frozen dinner required physical strength and a beard. The message was clear. Regular TV dinners were for women and children, but Hungry Man was for real men doing real work, even if that work was sitting on the couch, watching sports. The marketing was shameless. Commercials showed men devouring these massive meals with satisfaction, as if frozen Salisbury steak was the pinnacle of culinary achievement. Taglines like, "The big meal for big appetites" played into stereotypes about masculinity and hunger. It was capitalism meeting gender roles in the frozen food aisle, and it worked. Men bought Hungry Man dinners in droves, either because they genuinely needed more food, or because eating a regular TV dinner felt emasculating. Meanwhile, Banquet took a different approach. They went cheap, really cheap. Banquet dinners were priced for families on tight budgets, marketed as affordable, filling, and good enough. Their meals featured the same basic components: protein, starch, vegetable, but with even lower quality ingredients and less care in preparation. The turkey was grayer, the potatoes lumpier, the gravy thinner, but they cost 30 cents less than Swanson, and for families struggling to make ends, meat that mattered more than flavour. Banquet's strategy worked because there was a huge market for budget frozen dinners. Not everyone could afford Swanson's premium offerings, and Banquet filled that gap. Their commercials emphasised value and convenience, showing harried mothers feeding large families quickly and cheaply. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest in a way that Swanson's ads weren't. Banquet dinners weren't going to change your life, they were just going to keep you fed without breaking the bank. Morton, another major competitor, took yet another route. They added dessert. Morton's three-course dinners included a dedicated dessert compartment, usually filled with something resembling a brownie, cobbler, or pudding. It wasn't gourmet, but it was a selling point. Dessert turned a mundane frozen meal into a complete dining experience, or at least that's what the marketing claimed. In reality, the desserts were often the worst part, gummy, overly sweet, and somehow both burnt and undercooked at the same time. The competition heated up throughout the 1960s and 70s. Companies battled over shelf space, pricing, portion sizes, and variety. They introduced seasonal options, Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas ham, Easter meals, trying to capture holiday nostalgia in aluminum trays. They launched diet versions, kid-friendly versions, and ethnic versions, each one attempting to carve out a niche in the growing frozen food market. But here's the irony. Despite all the competition, the meals were mostly identical. Different brands, different packaging, same rubbery turkey and gluey mashed potatoes. The companies weren't competing on quality. They were competing on marketing, price, and perception. And consumers, desperate for convenience and variety, kept buying, even when the food tasted like reheated regret wrapped in foil. Here's what nobody mentioned in those cheerful 1950s commercials. TV dinners were nutritional disasters, high in sodium, low in vitamins, packed with preservatives and loaded with enough fat to make your arteries weep. These meals were convenient but catastrophic for long-term health. But in the 1950s and 60s, nutrition science was still catching up, and most Americans didn't know or didn't care what they were putting into their bodies. As long as dinner was fast, cheap, and didn't require effort, it was good enough. Let's start with sodium. TV dinners were salt bombs. A single meal could contain 1,500 to 2,000 milligrams of sodium, sometimes more. That's nearly an entire day's recommended intake in one tray. Why so much salt? Because salt is cheap, it enhances flavor, and it acts as a preservative. When you're mass-producing frozen food designed to sit in freezers for months, sodium becomes your best friend. But for consumers, it was a slow march toward high blood pressure, heart disease, and stroke. Then there was the fat content. TV dinners were loaded with it. Saturated fats, trans fats, all the bad kinds. The gravies were thickened with fat. The meats were often the fattiest cuts, chosen for cost rather than quality. The sides were frequently fried or cooked in butter substitutes that were basically hydrogenated oil pretending to be food. A typical hungry man dinner could pack 1,200 calories, 60 grams of fat, and enough cholesterol to make a cardiologist cry. And people ate them regularly, sometimes multiple times a week. Preservatives were another hidden issue. To keep TV dinners shelf-stable, manufacturers added chemicals like sodium nitrite, BHA, BHT, and various artificial colorings. These ingredients kept the food from spoiling and maintained its appearance, but they also raised questions about long-term health effects. In the 1950s, these concerns were largely ignored. The FDA approved these additives, and consumers trusted that approval without question. It wasn't until decades later that researchers began linking certain preservatives to cancer, allergies, and other health problems. Vegetables in TV dinners were a joke. They were overcooked, under-seasoned, and nutritionally depleted. Freezing food does preserve some nutrients, but the industrial cooking and reheating processes destroyed much of what remained. Those bright green peas. They got their colour from added dyes, not from freshness. The carrots were mushy because they'd been cooked to death before freezing, and the portions were tiny. A tablespoon of corn, a few limp green beans. TV dinners gave the illusion of balanced meals, but they were anything but. And let's talk about what TV dinners lacked. Fibre, fresh ingredients, real vegetables, and anything resembling whole grains. The bread rolls included in some dinners were made from white flour stripped of nutrients. There was no roughage, no greens, no nutritional density. These meals filled you up in the moment, but they left your body starving for actual nourishment. The real problem was that nobody was talking about it. Nutritionists in the 1960s began raising concerns, but their voices were drowned out by advertising, convenience culture, and the sheer popularity of frozen dinners. When health warnings did surface, they were dismissed as alarmist or elitist. Not everyone has time to cook from scratch, people argued. TV dinners are better than nothing, but better than nothing isn't the same as good, and over time, the health consequences became impossible to ignore. By the 1980s and 90s, the conversation shifted. Consumers became more health conscious, and frozen dinner companies scrambled to respond. They introduced light versions, healthy choice options, and meals labelled with calorie counts and nutritional information. But the damage had been done. An entire generation had grown up eating TV dinners regularly, consuming excessive sodium, fat, and preservatives without realising the cost. TV. Dinners didn't just change how America ate, they changed America's health, one aluminum tray at a time. Every TV dinner came in a disposable aluminum tray, and in the 1950s and 60s, Americans threw away millions of them, just tossed them in the trash without a second thought. Recycling wasn't a thing yet, and environmentalism was still decades away from mainstream consciousness. So those trays, along with the cardboard boxes they came in, ended up in landfills, piling up like monuments to convenience culture. Nobody considered the environmental impact because, frankly, nobody was thinking about the environment at all. Let's talk numbers. At the peak of TV dinner popularity in the 1960s, Swanson alone sold over 25 million dinners a year. Multiply that by competitors like Banquet, Morton, and Hungry Man, and you're looking at hundreds of millions of aluminum trays being produced, used once, and discarded annually. Aluminum production is energy-intensive, requiring massive amounts of electricity and generating significant greenhouse gas emissions. And all of that effort, mining, smelting, shaping, resulted in a product used for 25 minutes and then thrown away. The cardboard boxes weren't much better. They were printed with colourful graphics, coated with wax or plastic to protect the frozen contents, and designed to be eye-catching on store shelves. But that also meant they weren't easily biodegradable or recyclable. The wax coatings prevented them from breaking down naturally, and recycling programs that could handle them didn't exist yet. So into the trash they went, joining the aluminum trays in ever-growing piles of waste. In the 1950s and 60s, disposability was celebrated, not criticized. The post-war American consumer culture embraced the idea of single-use everything: paper plates, plastic cups, disposable diapers, and yes, throwaway meal trays. It was modern, efficient, and liberating. Why wash dishes when you could just throw them away? The environmental cost didn't register because the consequences weren't visible yet. Landfills were out of sight, out of mind, and pollution was someone else's problem. But by the 1970s, cracks began to show. The environmental movement gained momentum, spurred by visible pollution, oil spills, and growing awareness of finite resources. Activists started questioning the wisdom of disposable culture, and aluminum became a target. Producing aluminum from raw bauxite ore required enormous energy, but recycling aluminum used 95% less energy. The math was obvious. Recycling made sense, both economically and environmentally. Aluminum recycling programs began to emerge in the 1970s and 80s, driven by both environmental concerns and economic incentives. Suddenly, those TV dinner trays didn't have to be trash. They could be collected, melted down, and reformed into new products. Recycling bins appeared in communities, and consumers were encouraged to separate their aluminum waste. But even with recycling, the system wasn't perfect. Many trays were still contaminated with food residue, making them harder to process. And not all communities had recycling programs, meaning millions of trays still ended up in landfills. TV dinner manufacturers eventually responded to environmental pressure. Some switched to recyclable materials, others reduced packaging, and a few introduced microwavable plastic trays as an alternative to aluminum. But plastic brought its own problems: pollution, chemical leaching, and an even longer lifespan in landfills. It was a trade-off, not a solution. The legacy of those aluminum trays is still with us. Landfills from the 1950s and 60s contain layers of TV dinner packaging, buried and forgotten. The environmental cost of convenience culture was paid by the planet, and we're still paying it today. TV dinners taught America that disposability was desirable, that waste was acceptable, and that the future could clean up the mess we left behind. Spoiler alert, the future is now, and we're drowning in that mess. TV dinners didn't just change kitchens, they became cultural symbols, showing up in movies, TV shows, and eventually stand-up comedy routines. They represented modernity, convenience, and the American way of doing things fast and without much thought. But they also became punchlines, symbols of loneliness, laziness, and the decline of traditional family values. TV dinners were both aspirational and sad, modern and pathetic, depending on who was talking about them and when. In the 1960s, TV dinners appeared in television shows as symbols of modern living. Sitcom characters heated them up for quick meals, often while making jokes about their wives being away or their own inability to cook. It was played for laughs, but the underlying message was clear. TV dinners were for people who couldn't, or wouldn't, put in the effort to cook real food. They were shortcuts, and shortcuts were funny because they revealed weakness. By the 1970s and 80s, TV dinners became associated with loneliness. In movies and TV, the sad bachelor or divorced man was often shown eating a frozen dinner alone, illuminated by the glow of the television. It was visual shorthand for isolation, failure, and disconnection. The frozen dinner tray became a symbol of lives that had fallen apart. No family to cook for, no partner to share meals with, just you, your aluminum tray, and the TV keeping you company. Stand-up comedians had a field day with TV dinners. Jerry Seinfeld, George Carlin, and countless others riffed on their absurdity. The compartmentalized food, the styrofoam texture, the bizarre mismatch between the picture on the box and the reality inside. TV dinners were comedy gold because everyone knew exactly what they were talking about. Everyone had eaten one, been disappointed by one, and wondered why the dessert section was always so small. TV dinners also became nostalgic. By the 1990s and 2000s, people who'd grown up eating them in the 60s and 70s looked back fondly, remembering the excitement of peeling back the foil, the ritual of TV dinner night, the comfort of routine. Nostalgia smoothed over the bad taste and questionable nutrition, turning TV dinners into symbols of simpler times. Suddenly they weren't sad anymore, they were retro, kitsch, even charming. Pop culture also embraced TV dinner aesthetics. Artists used the trays in installations about consumerism and waste. Graphic designers incorporated the vintage packaging into posters and advertisements. The image of the aluminum tray, with its neat compartments and 1950s colour palette, became an icon of mid-century Americana. It represented a specific moment in history when optimism, technology, and capitalism collided in the frozen food aisle. TV dinners even made it into music. Songs referenced them as symbols of mundane modern life, quick meals for people too busy or too tired to care. Lyrics mentioned reheated turkey and TV trays, painting pictures of everyday existence in late 20th century America. They weren't glamorous, but they were real, and that authenticity resonated. Today, TV dinners still appear in pop culture, usually as references to the past. Period pieces set in the 1950s through 80s include scenes of families eating frozen dinners in front of the TV, grounding the story in historical reality. Comedies use them for jokes about bad cooking or lazy eating. Dramas use them to show isolation or poverty. The meaning shifts depending on context, but the image remains powerful. A simple aluminum tray that somehow encapsulates an entire era of American life. TV dinners weren't just food, they were stories, symbols, and cultural artifacts. They told us who we were, what we valued, and what we were willing to sacrifice for convenience. And whether we loved them, hated them, or simply tolerated them, they became part of our collective memory, one compartmentalized meal at a time. As TV dinners and frozen meals became more popular, something quietly disappeared: the knowledge of how to cook. Entire generations grew up without learning how to roast a chicken, bake bread, or make soup from scratch. These skills, passed down through families for centuries, began to fade, replaced by the ability to read package instructions and operate an oven timer. TV dinners didn't cause this decline alone. Other convenience foods, fast food restaurants, and changing work patterns all played roles, but they accelerated it, normalizing the idea that cooking from scratch was optional, not essential. In the 1950s, most women still knew how to cook. They'd learned from their mothers and grandmothers, standing in kitchens, watching, helping, absorbing techniques and recipes through repetition. Cooking wasn't just a skill, it was cultural knowledge, a way of preserving family identity and tradition. But as TV dinners became common, that transmission began to break down. Why teach your daughter to make pot roast when you could just buy a frozen version? Why spend hours teaching someone to bake when cakes came in boxes requiring only eggs and water? By the 1970s and 80s, the gap widened. Young adults moved out of their parents' homes without basic cooking skills, armed instead with knowledge of which frozen dinners tasted least terrible and how to use a microwave. College students subsisted on ramen, frozen pizzas, and TV dinners, because nobody had taught them anything else. Cooking from scratch seemed difficult, time-consuming, and unnecessary when convenience options were everywhere. The decline wasn't just about individual knowledge, it was structural. Home economics classes, once standard in schools, began to disappear or get defunded. The classes that remained often focused on nutrition theory rather than practical cooking skills. Students might learn about the food pyramid, but not how to chop an onion or make a basic sauce. The assumption was that cooking wasn't important anymore, that modern life had moved beyond it. Cookbooks tried to bridge the gap, but they often assumed foundational knowledge readers no longer had. Instructions like sauté until fragrant or fold in the egg whites meant nothing to someone who'd never cooked. The internet eventually helped, with step-by-step videos and beginner tutorials, but that came decades later, after multiple generations had already lost the thread. The consequences were real. People raised on TV dinners and fast food often didn't know how to feed themselves healthy, affordable meals. They relied on processed foods, takeout, and restaurants, spending more money and consuming worse nutrition than if they'd cooked at home. Studies showed that people who couldn't cook were more likely to be overweight, have diet-related health problems, and struggle financially because eating out was expensive. There was also a cultural loss. Family recipes disappeared, not because they were forgotten, but because nobody knew how to make them. Grandma's lasagna, Dad's BBQ ribs, Mum's apple pie, these became memories, not living traditions. Food that had connected generations was replaced by standardized corporate products that tasted the same whether you ate them in New York or Los Angeles. By the 2000s, there was a pushback. Celebrity chefs, cooking shows, and food bloggers began emphasizing the importance of home cooking, teaching basics and encouraging people to get back in the kitchen. Farmers' markets and farm-to-table movements celebrated fresh local ingredients. Slow food advocates pushed back against fast food culture. But the damage wasn't easily undone. Relearning skills that had been abandoned for decades was hard, especially when convenience options were still everywhere, still cheap and still tempting. TV dinners taught America that cooking was negotiable, that meals could come from factories instead of kitchens, and that convenience was more important than tradition. And once that lesson was learned, it was almost impossible to unlearn. If TV dinners were a game changer, the microwave oven was a nuclear bomb dropped on traditional cooking. When affordable microwaves hit American homes in the 1970s, frozen dinners evolved instantly. No more waiting 25 minutes in the oven. Now you could nuke your Salisbury steak in 4 minutes flat. The microwave didn't just speed up TV dinners, it redefined them, turning frozen meals from a convenience into an instant gratification machine. And America, always in a hurry, embraced it without hesitation. Microwaves had been around since the 1940s, invented accidentally by engineer Percy Spencer when he noticed a candy bar melting in his pocket while working with radar equipment. But early microwaves were massive, expensive, and mostly used in commercial settings. It wasn't until the 1970s that companies like Raytheon and Amana developed affordable countertop models for home use. By the mid-1980s, over 60% of American households owned a microwave, and by the 1990s, that number was over 90%. For TV dinner manufacturers, the microwave was a godsend. Oven heating had always been the bottleneck. 25 to 30 minutes was fast compared to cooking from scratch, but it still required planning and patience. Microwaves eliminated that. Suddenly, dinner could be ready in the time it took to watch a commercial break. Companies rushed to redesign their products for microwave cooking, swapping aluminum trays for plastic ones and adjusting recipes to account for uneven microwave heating. The shift to plastic trays brought new problems. Plastic was cheaper than aluminum and microwave safe, but it also felt flimsier, less substantial. And there were concerns, later proven valid, about chemicals leaching from plastic into food during heating. BPA, phthalates, and other compounds became health concerns, though it took years for regulations to catch up. In the meantime, millions of Americans microwaved their dinners in plastic trays, unknowingly consuming trace amounts of chemicals along with their mashed potatoes. Microwave cooking also changed the food itself. Microwaves heat unevenly, creating hot spots and cold spots, which meant your dinner might be scalding in the center and frozen at the edges. The texture suffered too. Microwaved food often became rubbery, soggy, or weirdly chewy. Manufacturers tried to compensate with special packaging, crisping sleeves, steam vents, multi-stage cooking instructions, but the fundamental problem remained. Microwaves weren't designed for quality, they were designed for speed. Still, speed won. Americans didn't care if their dinner was perfectly cooked. They cared that it was fast. The microwave turned TV dinners into snacks, meals into afterthoughts. You could eat dinner in your car, at your desk, standing in the kitchen, with the microwave door still open. Food became even more disposable, even more transactional. It wasn't about nourishment or enjoyment, it was about efficiency, about cramming calories into your body as quickly as possible so you could get back to work, to TV, to whatever else demanded your attention. The microwave also enabled new categories of frozen meals: hot pockets, lean pockets, microwavable burritos, breakfast sandwiches, single-serve pasta bowls. All of these existed because of microwave technology. The frozen food aisle exploded with options, each one promising a different flavor, a different cuisine, a different experience, all delivered in under 5 minutes. By the 1990s, the microwave had become so central to American life that it was impossible to imagine cooking without one. Recipes were written with microwave instructions. Cookbooks dedicated entire sections to microwave cooking. Children grew up thinking that cooking meant pressing buttons on a microwave and waiting for the beep. TV dinners and microwaves were a perfect match. Two technologies designed for a culture that valued speed above all else. Together they completed the transformation of the American meal from a social ritual into an individual, rushed, forgettable transaction. Dinner wasn't something you made or shared anymore. It was something you heated and consumed, alone, in 4 minutes or less. By the 1980s, Americans started asking a dangerous question. What if frozen dinners didn't taste like punishment? Enter the gourmet frozen meal trend. Brands like Lean Cuisine, Healthy Choice, and Stauffer's promising meals that were not just convenient but actually edible, maybe even enjoyable. These weren't your grandmother's TV dinners with grey turkey and mystery gravy. These were sophisticated, or at least they pretended to be. They had names like chicken masala, shrimp scampi, and beef burgundy. French-sounding words that implied elegance, even if the reality was still reheated frozen food in a plastic tray. The shift happened because consumer expectations changed. By the 1980s, Americans had been eating frozen dinners for 3 decades, and they were tired of settling for mediocre. The health food movement was gaining momentum. Yuppie culture was obsessed with quality and presentation, and suddenly, convenience alone wasn't enough. People wanted frozen meals that tasted good, looked appealing, and didn't make them feel like failures for not cooking from scratch. The food industry, always ready to capitalize on trends, responded with premium frozen meals that cost more but promised better quality. Lean cuisine launched in 1981, targeting health-conscious consumers, particularly women, who wanted portion-controlled, lower-calorie meals. The packaging was sleek and modern, featuring images of fresh vegetables and elegant plating that bore no resemblance to the actual product inside. But the marketing worked. Lean cuisine became synonymous with dieting and healthy eating, even though many of their meals were still loaded with sodium and processed ingredients. The genius was in the branding. They weren't selling frozen dinners anymore. They were selling a lifestyle, an identity, a version of yourself that was disciplined, health-conscious, and in control. Healthy Choice followed in 1989 with a similar pitch but added a backstory. The founder supposedly created the brand after a heart attack, determined to make healthier frozen meals. True or not, the narrative sold. Healthy Choice meals featured whole grains, reduced fat, and natural ingredients, though natural was doing a lot of heavy lifting. The meals still came in plastic trays and contained preservatives, but they felt healthier, and in consumer culture, feeling healthy is half the battle. Stouffer's took a different approach. Instead of marketing health, they marketed indulgence. Their frozen meals were richer, more decadent, with cream sauces, cheesy pasta dishes, and desserts included. Stouffer's wasn't trying to help you lose weight. They were trying to give you restaurant-quality meals at home. Their packaging featured elegant fonts and sophisticated plating, and their commercials emphasized taste and satisfaction over convenience. It was aspirational frozen food for people who wanted to feel fancy while eating alone on the couch. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Most of these gourmet frozen meals weren't that much better than the original TV dinners. Sure, the ingredients were slightly higher quality, the flavors more complex, the presentation more attractive, but they were still mass-produced, frozen, and reheated. The vegetables were still mushy, the sauces still congealed, and the portions still disappointingly small. A lean cuisine chicken Alfredo might look elegant on the box, but inside it was 8 pieces of rubbery chicken, a tablespoon of sauce, and some overcooked broccoli. You paid more for the illusion of quality, not the reality. Still, the gourmet frozen meal trend succeeded because it gave consumers something they desperately wanted: permission to keep eating frozen dinners without feeling bad about it. If your meal was healthy or gourmet, then you weren't lazy or unhealthy, you were smart, efficient, and discerning. The food industry had figured out that convenience with a veneer of sophistication was even more marketable than convenience alone. By the 1990s, the frozen food aisle was split into tiers: budget meals for people who just needed calories, standard TV dinners for the nostalgic or unconcerned, and premium gourmet options for people who wanted to pretend they had standards. Each tier served a different psychological need, but they all ended the same way. You, alone, eating reheated food from a plastic tray, wondering if this really counted as dinner. Here's something nobody likes to admit. TV dinners were always tied to class. In the 1950s, they were marketed as modern and aspirational. You had a TV, you had a freezer, you were living the American dream. But by the 1970s, the image shifted. TV dinners became associated with poverty, laziness, and low status. Eating frozen dinners meant you couldn't afford better food, didn't have time to cook, or didn't care enough to try. They became a marker of class division, separating those who could afford fresh, home-cooked meals from those who couldn't. The shift wasn't subtle. In the 1950s and 60s, TV dinner commercials featured middle-class families in suburban homes, smiling and content. The meals were portrayed as modern conveniences for busy, successful people. But by the 1970s and 80s, as fresher, healthier food became status symbols, frozen dinners lost their glamour. Suddenly, eating TV dinners wasn't modern, it was sad. It meant you were struggling financially, working multiple jobs, or living alone without anyone to cook for. The cultural narrative shifted from "look how convenient" to "look how far they've fallen." This class divide was reinforced by grocery store layouts. Frozen dinners were cheap, accessible, and required no preparation skills, making them lifelines for low-income families. A single mother working 2 jobs could feed her kids quickly and affordably with TV dinners, even if it wasn't nutritious or delicious. But wealthier families could afford fresh vegetables, quality meats, and the time to cook from scratch. They didn't need TV dinners, and not needing them became a form of social capital. Food snobbery also played a role. By the 1980s and 90s, foodie culture was emerging. Cooking shows, celebrity chefs, and gourmet magazines celebrated fresh ingredients, complex techniques, and culinary sophistication. Eating well became an identity marker for the educated upper middle class. And in that world, TV dinners were embarrassing, a confession of failure, a sign that you didn't know better or couldn't do better. Admitting you ate frozen dinners regularly was like admitting you watched reality TV or shopped at discount stores. It marked you as lower class, less refined, less aspirational. But here's the hypocrisy. Wealthy people ate frozen food too, just different frozen food. They bought organic frozen pizzas, gourmet frozen appetizers, and premium ice cream. They shopped at Whole Foods and Trader Joe's, where frozen meals came in prettier packaging with words like artisan, sustainable, and small batch. The food was still frozen, still mass-produced, but the branding made it acceptable. TV dinners, with their aluminum trays and retro packaging, couldn't escape their working-class roots. They were permanently marked as low status, no matter how much Swanson tried to rebrand. The class dynamics also played out in schools. Kids from wealthier families brought homemade lunches or bought fresh cafeteria meals. Kids from poorer families brought frozen dinners reheated that morning, wrapped in foil, already cold by lunchtime. Teachers noticed, other students noticed. Food became another way to measure social status, another marker of who had resources and who didn't. And then there was the shame. People who relied on TV dinners often felt embarrassed about it, even though they were doing their best with limited time and money. Nutritionists and food activists criticized frozen dinners as unhealthy and irresponsible, implying that people who ate them were neglecting themselves or their families. But that criticism ignored the reality. For many people, TV dinners weren't a choice, they were a necessity. When you're working 60 hours a week to make rent, when you don't have access to fresh grocery stores, when you're exhausted and broke, TV dinners are what you eat because they are what you can afford and manage. TV dinners exposed a fundamental truth about American society. Convenience and quality are privileges. Those who could afford time, knowledge, and resources ate better. Those who couldn't made do with frozen trays of mystery meat and instant mashed potatoes. And rather than addressing the structural inequalities that created this divide, society judged people for the food they ate, turning dinner into another way to measure worth. Despite everything, the awful taste, the health concerns, the environmental waste, TV dinners have become oddly nostalgic. People who grew up eating them now look back with a strange fondness, remembering the ritual of peeling back the foil, the smell of reheated turkey, the excitement of getting the dessert section. It doesn't matter that the food was terrible. Nostalgia smooths over the rough edges, turning mediocre frozen meals into warm childhood memories. TV dinners became symbols not of what they were, but of when they were, a time that feels simpler, safer, more innocent in retrospect. Nostalgia is powerful because it's not really about the past, it's about how we remember the past. When people say they miss TV dinners, they don't actually miss the food. They miss being kids sitting cross-legged on the carpet, watching cartoons, with no responsibilities beyond finishing their peas. They miss family TV nights, even if those nights were mostly silent. They miss the routines and rituals that made childhood feel predictable and safe. The TV dinner is just the vehicle for those feelings, the sensory trigger that brings the memories flooding back. Part of the nostalgia is aesthetic. The vintage packaging with its bright colours, retro fonts and optimistic imagery has become iconic. Designers use TV dinner trays in art projects. Collectors hunt for original boxes. Retro diners serve food in aluminum compartment trays as a kitschy callback to the 1950s. The look and feel of TV dinners evoke a specific era. Post-war optimism, space-age technology, suburban expansion, and that era, for better or worse, holds cultural power. There's also novelty nostalgia. TV dinners represent a moment when frozen meals were new and exciting, not ubiquitous and boring. In the 1950s, eating a TV dinner felt futuristic, like something from the Jetsons. Now, in an era of artisan everything and farm-to-table dining, frozen dinners feel quaint and harmless. A reminder of a time when Americans were less cynical about mass-produced food. Eating one ironically, ordering a vintage Swanson dinner for fun, posting it on Instagram, lets people engage with the past without its consequences. But the nostalgia isn't universal. For people who had no choice but to eat TV dinners regularly, who couldn't afford better food, who associated frozen dinners with struggle and scarcity, there's no warm glow of memory. For them, TV dinners represent hardship, not comfort. Nostalgia is a privilege, available mostly to those whose memories aren't weighed down by necessity. Still, the cultural nostalgia persists. TV dinners appear in period pieces, retro-themed restaurants, and museum exhibits about mid-century American life. They're referenced in songs, movies, and memes. They've become shorthand for a bygone era, a visual and sensory symbol that immediately communicates 1950s, 1970s America. And because they're gone, or at least transformed into something unrecognizable, they feel safe to romanticize. The nostalgia also reveals something about modern life. People miss simplicity, even if that simplicity was an illusion. TV dinners represented a time when meals were straightforward, when there weren't 100 dietary trends to navigate, when you didn't have to worry about gluten, GMOs, or carbon footprints. You just opened the freezer, grabbed a tray, heated it up, and ate. No decisions, no guilt, no complications. In today's world of overwhelming food choices and constant anxiety about eating correctly, that simplicity sounds appealing, even if the food itself was garbage. So people buy retro TV dinners when they can find them, not because they taste good, they don't, but because eating them feels like time travel. For a few minutes, while picking at rubbery turkey and gluey mashed potatoes, they're kids again, sitting in front of the TV, with nothing to worry about except whether the dessert section is big enough. It's a comforting lie, and nostalgia sells comforting lies better than any advertising campaign ever could. TV dinners never really died. They just evolved. Today's frozen meal aisle is vast and bewildering. Organic options, keto-friendly meals, plant-based proteins, internationally inspired cuisine, portion-controlled diet meals, and yes, still some classic Salisbury steak for the diehards. But the aluminum tray and the TV dinner name have mostly disappeared, replaced by sleeker packaging, fancier descriptions, and a dizzying array of dietary specializations. The core concept remains the same: frozen, pre-made meals for convenience. But the execution has transformed beyond recognition. The first major shift was microwavability. Once microwaves became standard in the 1980s, frozen meals ditched the oven entirely. Companies redesigned packaging for microwave cooking, using plastic trays, steam vents, and special sleeves that promised crispiness. Meals that once took 25 minutes now took 4, and that speed became the new baseline. Anything that couldn't be microwaved felt outdated, irrelevant, too much effort. The second shift was health consciousness. By the 1990s and 2000s, consumers demanded healthier options. Brands like Lean Cuisine, Healthy Choice, and Smart Ones dominated freezer aisles, marketing portion control, reduced calories, and lower fat content. These meals targeted dieters, offering structured eating plans that promised weight loss without sacrifice. The portions were tiny, the sodium still high, but the messaging worked. People bought them by the millions, trading satisfaction for the illusion of health. Then came the specialty diet explosion. Gluten-free, paleo, keto, vegan, vegetarian, low-carb, high-protein, every dietary trend spawned its own line of frozen meals. Companies like Amy's Kitchen and Evol catered to organic and natural food consumers. Brands like Atkins and South Beach offered meals aligned with specific diet plans. Suddenly, the frozen food aisle wasn't just about convenience, it was about identity. Your choice of frozen meal signaled your values, your lifestyle, your tribe. Ethnic and international options also exploded. TV dinners in the 1960s offered laughably inauthentic Italian or Chinese meals, but by the 2000s, frozen food companies hired chefs, studied global cuisines, and produced meals that actually resembled the real thing, or at least came closer. Thai curry, Indian tikka masala, Korean bibimbap, Mexican street tacos, all available in the freezer aisle, ready in minutes. Globalization came to frozen food, letting Americans sample cuisines they'd never encounter otherwise. Premium frozen meals also emerged, targeting consumers willing to pay more for quality. Brands like Trader Joe's, Whole Foods 365, and boutique companies offered restaurant-quality meals at grocery store prices. These weren't cheap, $6 to $10 per meal, but they promised real ingredients, chef-inspired recipes, and flavors that didn't taste like sadness. They bridged the gap between fast food and home cooking, offering a middle ground for people who wanted better than TV dinners but couldn't or wouldn't cook from scratch. Meal kit services like HelloFresh and Blue Apron also disrupted the frozen meal market, though they operated differently. Instead of fully prepared frozen meals, they delivered fresh ingredients with recipes, allowing consumers to cook without the hassle of meal planning or grocery shopping. They weren't frozen, but they filled the same niche: convenient, pre-portioned meals for busy people. And they succeeded because they offered something TV dinners never could: the satisfaction of cooking without the effort. But even with all these innovations, the fundamental appeal remained unchanged: convenience. Whether it's a $2 banquet meal or a $10 organic Buddha bowl, frozen meals exist because people don't have time, energy, or desire to cook. Modern life is still rushed, still exhausting, still demanding, and the food industry is still there, ready to sell you dinner in a box, promising that this time, finally, it'll taste good. TV dinners may have faded, but their descendants are everywhere, multiplying, specializing, adapting to new trends and tastes. The aluminum tray is gone, but the core bargain remains. Trade time and effort for speed and convenience, and hope the food doesn't taste like regret. That aluminum tray, the one that started it all, has become a relic, a symbol of mid-century American innovation, hubris, and shortcuts. Museums display them now. collectors hunt for vintage trays. Artists use them in installations about consumerism and waste. The tray, once thrown away by the millions without a second thought, is now a cultural artifact, a physical reminder of a moment when America chose convenience over everything else and never looked back. The design itself was brilliant in its simplicity. 3 or 4 compartments, each sized for a different component of the meal: protein, starch, vegetable, dessert. The compartments kept food separate, preventing the gravy from seeping into the cobbler, the peas from touching the turkey. It was organised, efficient, predictable. For people who craved control in an increasingly chaotic world, the compartmentalised tray offered a small measure of order. Everything had its place, nothing overlapped, and you always knew what you were getting. But the tray also symbolised something darker: the industrialisation of food and family life. Meals that had once been prepared by hand, served on real plates, shared around a table, were now mass-produced, packaged in aluminum, and eaten in isolation. The tray represented the fragmentation of American family life: separate meals, separate spaces, separate experiences. It was a physical manifestation of disconnection. The aluminum itself tells a story. Aluminum was once considered a precious metal, more valuable than gold. Napoleon III famously served his most honoured guests on aluminum plates while everyone else used gold. But by the mid-20th century, aluminum production had become cheap and industrial. Using aluminum for disposable meal trays would have been unthinkable a century earlier, but in post-war America, abundance and waste went hand in hand. The tray embodied throw-away culture: use it once, toss it, repeat. Today, vintage TV dinner trays are oddly desirable. Antique stores sell them. Etsy shops feature them. People use them for craft projects, planters, or nostalgic home decor. The trays that were once garbage are now collectibles, valued not for function but for the memories and aesthetics they represent. It's ironic. Something designed to be disposable has become something people try to preserve. The tray's design also influenced other products. Cafeteria trays in schools, airline meal trays, military rations, all borrow the compartmentalised concept. The idea that food should be separated, portioned and contained spread far beyond TV dinners. Even modern bento boxes and meal prep containers owe a debt to that original aluminum tray, whether they acknowledge it or not. But the legacy isn't entirely sentimental. The TV dinner tray also represents environmental short-sightedness. Millions of trays were produced, used once, and discarded, before anyone questioned the consequences. They piled up in landfills, leached into soil, and became part of a larger story about American waste and consumption. The tray is a monument to our collective belief that convenience is worth any cost, even if we pay that cost in damaged ecosystems and depleted resources. Still, the tray endures in memory, in museums and in the cultural imagination. It's a symbol of a specific moment in history when technology, capitalism, and domestic life collided in the frozen food aisle. It represents optimism and laziness, innovation and decline, progress and loss. It's a simple piece of aluminum, but it contains multitudes, the hopes, failures, and contradictions of post-war America, all served up in 3 neat compartments. America wasn't the only country to embrace frozen convenience meals, but each culture adapted them differently. In Japan, bento-style frozen meals became an art form, beautifully arranged, balanced, and actually tasty. In the UK, frozen ready meals evolved into a massive industry, with brands like Bird's Eye and Findus offering everything from shepherd's pie to chicken tikka masala. In France, where food culture is sacred, frozen meals were initially resisted but eventually found a niche, especially among busy urban professionals. TV dinners, it turned out, were a global phenomenon, but the way each country approached them revealed deep cultural differences about food, family, and convenience. Japan's approach was elegant. Japanese frozen meals, often called rito shokuhin, emphasized presentation, variety, and balance. Even a frozen bento included multiple small portions: rice, fish, pickled vegetables, egg, seaweed, each carefully arranged and portioned. The goal wasn't just to feed people quickly, but to maintain aesthetic and nutritional standards even in convenience food. Japanese convenience stores like 7-Eleven offered frozen meals that looked and tasted restaurant quality, far surpassing anything America produced. The cultural expectation that food should be beautiful, even when frozen, shaped the entire industry. In the UK, frozen ready meals took off in the 1970s and 80s, driven by busy lifestyles and microwave adoption. But British frozen meals leaned heavily into comfort food: cottage pie, fish and chips, bangers and mash, full English breakfasts. They were hearty, unpretentious, and often quite good. Brands like Iceland and Marks and Spencer made frozen meals socially acceptable across class lines, offering budget options and premium versions side by side. The British didn't fetishize home cooking the way some cultures did, so frozen meals integrated into daily life without much stigma. France, meanwhile, struggled with the concept. French food culture values fresh ingredients, long preparation, and communal dining. Frozen meals felt like an assault on tradition, a betrayal of culinary heritage. But economics and changing lifestyles eventually forced adaptation. French frozen meal companies like Picard emerged, offering high-quality frozen foods, croissants, coq au vin, ratatouille, that maintained French culinary standards while acknowledging modern time constraints. Picard became successful not by abandoning French food values, but by applying them to frozen food, proving that convenience and quality didn't have to be opposites. In Scandinavia, frozen meals emphasized sustainability and health. Norwegian and Swedish brands focused on locally sourced ingredients, minimal processing, and environmentally friendly packaging. Frozen meals included fish, root vegetables, and whole grains, reflecting regional dietary traditions. The approach was practical, not aspirational, frozen food as a tool for efficient living, not a symbol of modernity or decline. In developing countries, frozen meals took different forms. In India, brands like MTR and ITC offered frozen versions of traditional dishes, dal, biryani, paneer tikka, aimed at urban, professionals and overseas Indians craving home flavors. In Latin America, frozen empanadas, tamales, and pre-made arepas became popular, blending traditional foods with modern convenience. The meals adapted to local tastes rather than imposing foreign standards. What's striking is that TV dinners, despite their American origins, didn't homogenize global food culture. Instead, each country bent the concept to fit its values, ingredients, and traditions. The frozen meal became a canvas onto which cultures projected their beliefs about food, family, and time. Americans chose speed and compartmentalization. Japanese chose beauty and balance. British chose comfort and practicality. French chose quality despite convenience. Each approach revealed something essential about national identity. TV dinners proved that convenience was universal, but how you achieved it, what you were willing to sacrifice, and what you insisted on preserving was deeply cultural. The aluminum tray may have been American, but the frozen meal belonged to the world, and each country made it their own. Behind every TV dinner was food science, the study of how to freeze, preserve, and reheat food without turning it into mush. Flash freezing, pioneered by Clarence Birdseye, was key. Freezing food quickly prevented large ice crystals from forming and destroying cell walls, but that was just the beginning. Creating a frozen meal that tasted edible after reheating required understanding moisture content, fat distribution, starch behavior, and the complex chemistry of cooked food. TV dinners weren't just assembled, they were engineered. The first challenge was moisture. Water in food expands when frozen, forming ice crystals that puncture cell membranes. When the food thaws and reheats, those ruptured cells leak liquid, turning crisp vegetables into soggy mush and tender meat into rubber. Flash freezing helped by creating smaller crystals, but it wasn't perfect. Food scientists had to carefully control moisture levels before freezing, blanching vegetables to remove excess water, coating proteins in sauces to retain moisture, balancing wet and dry ingredients to prevent freezer burn. Freezer burn was another enemy. When frozen food is exposed to air, ice sublimates, turns directly from solid to gas, leaving behind dry, discoloured patches that taste like cardboard. TV dinner manufacturers combated this with tight packaging, moisture barriers, and vacuum sealing techniques. The goal was to lock food in a stable frozen state, preventing air exposure and moisture loss. Those aluminum trays and tight-fitting cardboard boxes weren't just for convenience, they were essential for preservation. Then there was the reheating problem. Ovens and microwaves heat unevenly, creating hot spots and cold spots. A TV dinner had to survive being blasted with heat, without some components burning while others stayed frozen. Food scientists addressed this through compartmentalization. Thicker, denser foods in one section, delicate items in another, and by adjusting cooking times and temperatures. Some components were partially cooked before freezing, others fully cooked, depending on how they'd respond to reheating. Texture was perhaps the hardest challenge. Freezing changes food at a molecular level. Starches crystallize, proteins denature, fats separate. Mashed potatoes that were creamy fresh became gluey when frozen and reheated. Gravies that were smooth became grainy. Vegetables that were crisp became limp. Food scientists compensated with additives, emulsifiers to keep fats blended, stabilizers to maintain texture, modified starches that resisted crystallization. These weren't just preservatives. They were textural engineers fighting the natural consequences of freezing. Flavor was another casualty of the freezing process. Volatile flavor compounds evaporate or degrade over time, even in frozen food. What tasted good, fresh, often tasted bland after months in a freezer. To compensate, TV dinner manufacturers over-seasoned, adding extra salt, sugar and fat to ensure flavors survived freezing and reheating. That's why frozen meals tasted so intense, often overwhelmingly salty or sweet. They were formulated for post-freezing palates, not fresh ones. Food scientists also had to consider nutritional degradation. Vitamins, especially water-soluble ones like vitamin C and B vitamins, break down during cooking, freezing and storage. By the time you ate a TV dinner, much of its nutritional value had evaporated. Manufacturers tried to compensate by fortifying meals with vitamins and minerals, but it was a band-aid on a bigger problem. Fresh food simply retained nutrients better than frozen, processed and reheated food ever could. Despite these challenges, the science improved over decades. Modern flash freezing is faster and more efficient. Packaging has evolved to better protect food. Additives have become more sophisticated, maintaining texture and flavor with fewer side effects. But the fundamental truth remains. Freezing food is a compromise. You gain convenience and shelf life but lose freshness, texture and often nutrition. TV dinners were triumphs of food science, but they were also admissions that perfection wasn't possible, only acceptable was. Let's ask the uncomfortable question. Did TV dinners make Americans lazier? Critics argue yes, that by removing the effort from cooking we lost something essential. The connection between effort and nourishment. The satisfaction of creating something from scratch. the discipline of planning and executing a meal. TV dinners in this view weren't just convenient, they were corrosive, eroding skills, values, and self-sufficiency. They taught Americans that shortcuts were acceptable, that instant gratification was a right, and that effort itself was optional. There's something to this argument. Cooking requires planning, patience, and problem-solving. You have to shop for ingredients, manage time, adjust recipes when things go wrong, and clean up afterward. These aren't just tasks, they're skills that build competence and confidence. When TV dinners replaced home cooking, people lost opportunities to develop those skills. They became passive consumers instead of active creators, buying solutions instead of making them. TV dinners also normalized low standards. When you cook from scratch, you control the ingredients, seasonings, and quality. When you eat a TV dinner, you accept whatever a factory produced. And if it tastes bad, well, it's only $4.04, so who cares? This acceptance of mediocrity in food, in effort, in standards, arguably spread beyond the kitchen. If dinner doesn't have to be good, what else doesn't have to be good? TV dinners taught a generation that good enough was fine, even when better was possible. But this critique ignores context. TV dinners didn't make people lazy. They responded to people who were exhausted, overworked, and struggling to balance competing demands. Women entering the workforce in the 1960s and 70s didn't have time to cook elaborate meals because they were working full-time jobs and still doing all the housework. Single parents juggling multiple responsibilities grabbed TV dinners because they were drowning in obligations, not because they were lazy. TV dinners were survival tools, not moral failures. The laziness critique also reeks of privilege. Cooking from scratch requires time, money, knowledge, and access to fresh ingredients. Not everyone has those resources. Calling someone lazy for eating TV dinners ignores systemic barriers, food deserts where fresh produce isn't available, poverty that makes cheap frozen meals the only affordable option, work schedules that leave no time for cooking. For many people, TV dinners weren't about laziness, they were about survival in a system designed to exhaust them. There's also a gender dimension to this critique. Women, who did most of the cooking, were often the ones accused of laziness for using TV dinners. The underlying message was that they were shirking their duties, taking shortcuts, failing their families. But this ignored the reality that women were doing double or triple duty, working outside the home, managing households and raising children. TV dinners gave them a few minutes of relief, and society punished them for it, framing convenience as moral failure rather than practical necessity. Still, there's a middle ground. TV dinners didn't make Americans lazy, but they did normalize outsourcing basic life skills. Cooking, like reading or budgeting, is a foundational competency. When entire generations grew up without learning it, that had consequences, health problems, financial struggles, and disconnection from food sources. TV dinners contributed to that loss, even if they weren't the sole cause. The real question isn't whether TV dinners made us lazy, it's whether convenience is worth the trade-offs. We gained time, lost skills, we gained ease, lost satisfaction, we gained efficiency, lost connection. TV dinners forced that bargain on American society, and we're still deciding whether we got a fair deal. There's something weirdly satisfying about compartmentalized food, each item in its own space, nothing touching, everything controlled. Psychologists suggest this appeals to our desire for order, predictability, and control in a chaotic world. TV dinners, with their neat aluminum compartments, tapped into that psychological need, offering structure and clarity in an otherwise messy experience. The compartments weren't just practical, they were comforting, a small way to impose order on a world that often felt overwhelming. Children especially love compartmentalized food. Kids' lunch trays, bento boxes, and TV dinners all follow the same principle: separate spaces for separate foods. Part of this is sensory. Many children are sensitive to textures and flavours. Mixing and compartments prevent that. But it's also about autonomy and control. When food is separated, children can choose what to eat and when, exercising agency in a life where adults usually decide everything. Compartmentalized food is empowering, giving kids a sense of control over at least one part of their day. They can eat the dessert first if they want, or save it for last. They can ignore the peas entirely without them contaminating the mashed potatoes. Each compartment is a choice, a small decision in a life where most decisions are made for them. For adults, the appeal is different but related. Life is messy, unpredictable, and chaotic. Work is stressful, relationships are complicated, and the world is full of uncertainty. But a TV dinner? That's simple. You know exactly what you're getting. Turkey in this compartment, peas in that one, potatoes over there. Nothing surprises you. Nothing disappoints you beyond the baseline expectation of mediocrity. It's predictable, and, in a world where so little is, that predictability is soothing. There's comfort in knowing that every Swanson turkey dinner will be exactly the same, whether you buy it in 1955 or 1975, whether you heat it in Maine or California. Consistency, even mediocre consistency, feels safer than uncertainty. Compartmentalization also reduces decision fatigue. When food is mixed together, casseroles, stews, stir-fries, you have to decide whether you like the combination, how much of each component to eat, how to balance flavors. It requires active engagement. But with compartmentalized food, decisions are made for you. Each item is separate, pre-portioned, ready to eat in any order you choose. It's eating on autopilot, and for exhausted, overstimulated people, autopilot is a relief. You don't have to think about how the peas will taste with the gravy. You don't have to consider whether the turkey and potato should be eaten together or separately. The compartments have already decided for you. Your only job is to consume. There's also an aesthetic component. Compartmentalized food looks organized, intentional, almost zen. The visual appeal of separate defined spaces satisfies the same part of our brain that enjoys organized closets, color-coded calendars, and neatly arranged bookshelves. It's order made visible, chaos contained. TV dinners may not have tasted good, but they looked organized, and that alone provided a small measure of satisfaction. Opening a TV dinner was like opening a perfectly packed suitcase, everything in its place, nothing overlapping, geometric precision on a plate. In a world that felt increasingly disorganized and overwhelming, that visual order was genuinely comforting, even if the food itself was disappointing. The compartments also created psychological boundaries that made eating feel safer for certain personality types. People with anxiety, obsessive tendencies, or control issues often prefer compartmentalized food because it eliminates the unpredictability of mixed dishes. There's no risk of unexpected textures, no surprise flavor combinations, no contamination between components. Each bite is exactly what you expect it to be. For people who crave control in a world that rarely offers it, compartmentalized food is a small victory, a tiny domain where everything behaves predictably and nothing goes wrong. But compartmentalization has a darker side. By keeping food separate, TV dinners reinforced binary thinking. Meat is meat. Vegetables are vegetables. Never the twain shall meet. This discouraged culinary creativity and adventurousness. People who grew up eating TV dinners often became adults who preferred bland, predictable food, resistant to complex flavors or mixed dishes. Compartmentalization trained palates to expect simplicity, to fear mixing, to choose separation over integration. It created eaters who were uncomfortable with culinary fusion, who wrinkled their noses at dishes where ingredients mingled and flavors combined in unexpected ways. The TV dinner palate was a conservative palate, suspicious of novelty and devoted to predictability. It also mirrored broader American cultural values. Post-war America loved categorization. Suburbs separated from cities, work separated from home, men's roles separated from women's. TV dinners reflected and reinforced that impulse, suggesting that separation was natural, desirable, and correct. Everything in its place, nothing overlapping, clear boundaries between distinct categories. It was food as ideology, dinner as cultural messaging. The compartmentalized tray became a physical manifestation of how Americans thought society should be organized. Separate but equal spaces, clear divisions between different elements, no mixing, no integration, everything maintaining its distinct identity. The TV dinner wasn't just feeding bodies, it was feeding a world view. Compartmentalization also allowed for the illusion of balance. Even though TV dinners were nutritionally terrible, high in sodium, low in vitamins, packed with preservatives, the visual presentation suggested otherwise. Look, there's protein, starch, and vegetable, all in their proper places. It must be a balanced meal, right? The compartments created a visual rhetoric of nutrition that had nothing to do with actual nutritional value. It was geometric health, if it looked organized, and included representatives from different food groups. It seemed healthy, even when it wasn't. This visual trickery taught Americans to judge food by appearance rather than content, to trust packaging over ingredients, to believe that if something looked balanced, it probably was. The psychology of compartmentalized food also reveals our relationship with abundance and scarcity. TV dinners offered controlled portions in separated spaces, creating the illusion of abundance. Look at all these different foods, while actually delivering very little. Each compartment was small, the portions minimal, but the division made it seem like more. This sleight of hand taught consumers to accept less while feeling like they were getting more. A psychological trick that extended far beyond frozen dinners into all aspects of consumer culture. Today, compartmentalized food is everywhere. Meal prep containers, bento boxes, divided plates for picky eaters, charcuterie boards arranged in careful sections. The TV dinner tray may be gone, but its psychological legacy endures. We still crave order, control, and predictability. We still find comfort in separation, in knowing exactly what we're getting and where. Compartmentalized food isn't just practical, it's therapeutic. A small way to impose structure on a world that feels increasingly chaotic and overwhelming. Every time we arrange food in separate containers, every time we keep our salad dressing in a little cup on the side, every time we prefer our foods not to touch, we're channeling the spirit of that original aluminum TV dinner tray, seeking order, control, and predictability in the one small domain where we can still find it, our plates. The compartments taught us that separation was safety, that boundaries were necessary, that mixing was risky. And those lessons, learned over thousands of TV dinners eaten in front of glowing screens, became part of how we see the world. Not just our food, but everything, our relationships, our communities, our lives. The TV dinner didn't just feed us. It taught us how to think about order, chaos, and the spaces between. And we're still living in those compartments, whether we realize it or not. In the end, TV dinners were never really about food. They were about time, convenience, and the American obsession with speed. They represented a trade-off: flavor for efficiency, tradition for modernity, homemade for mass-produced. They taught us that dinner didn't have to be an event, that meals could be transactional, that eating was just another task to check off the list. TV dinners fundamentally reshaped how Americans thought about food, family, and what it meant to live in the modern world. The most obvious lesson was that time is the ultimate currency. TV dinners promised to save time, 25 minutes instead of 2 hours, 4 minutes instead of 25, and Americans bought it, literally and figuratively, because time felt scarce. Work demanded more hours, commutes got longer, leisure time shrank. TV dinners offered a solution: sacrifice quality, gain time. It was a Faustian bargain, but we took it anyway, believing that speed was more valuable than anything we'd lose. This logic didn't stay in the kitchen, it spread everywhere. Fast fashion replaced tailored clothing, instant communication replaced thoughtful letters, quick fixes replaced long-term solutions. TV dinners were the prototype for a culture that would eventually value speed above nearly everything else. TV dinners also taught us that convenience justifies almost anything. Bad taste? Worth it for convenience. Poor nutrition? Worth it for convenience. Environmental waste? Worth it for convenience. The TV dinner was the ultimate convenience product, and its success proved that Americans would accept nearly any compromise if it meant less effort. This mindset spread beyond food, fast fashion, disposable products, instant everything. TV dinners were patient zero in the convenience epidemic that now defines modern consumer culture. We learned that discomfort, effort, and delay were problems to be solved, not experiences to be valued. That waiting was failure. That difficulty meant something was wrong with the system, not an opportunity for growth or learning. They normalized isolation. Before TV dinners, meals were communal by necessity. Someone cooked, everyone gathered, food was shared. TV dinners made eating solitary. Each person could have their own meal, their own tray, their own experience. Family dinners, once sacred, became optional. Conversation, connection, and shared experience were replaced by individual consumption and television watching. TV dinners didn't cause social fragmentation alone, but they facilitated it, proving that isolation could be marketed as liberation. And once we accepted that meals didn't need to be shared, it became easier to accept that other experiences didn't need to be shared either. Entertainment became individualized. Headphones instead of concerts, streaming instead of theatres, smartphones instead of conversation. TV dinners showed us that being alone together was not just possible, but preferable, efficient, modern. TV dinners also revealed class divisions in American society. They were simultaneously aspirational and stigmatized, modern and sad, convenient and desperate. They exposed who had resources and who didn't, who had time and who didn't, who could afford better and who couldn't. Food became another marker of inequality, and TV dinners sat at the intersection of convenience and necessity, serving both choice and desperation. The wealthy could choose to eat frozen meals or not. The poor often had no choice. And that distinction between convenience as luxury and convenience as survival defined much of late 20th century American life. TV dinners taught us that the same product could mean completely different things depending on who was eating it and why. Perhaps most importantly, TV dinners taught us that industrial solutions could replace human labor. Cooking, a skill passed down through generations, could be outsourced to factories. Meals, once made with care and knowledge, could be mass-produced by machines. TV dinners proved that tradition, craft, and personal effort were negotiable, replaceable, and often unnecessary. This lesson extended far beyond dinner. Automation, outsourcing, and technological replacement became defining features of modern life, and it all started with a frozen turkey in an aluminum tray. We learned that human touch wasn't essential, that expertise could be engineered away, that personalization was less important than standardization. TV dinners were industrial food for an increasingly industrial society, and they taught us to accept, even embrace, the idea that machines could do what people once did, faster and cheaper, even if the result was soulless. TV dinners also taught us about marketing and perception. They proved that packaging, branding, and advertising could sell almost anything, regardless of quality. The gap between the image on the box and the reality inside the tray was enormous, yet people kept buying. This taught companies a valuable lesson. Perception matters more than reality. If you can make something look appealing, taste almost doesn't matter. If you can tell the right story, liberation, modernity, progress, people will buy the product even when it disappoints them. TV dinner, advertising pioneered techniques that are now standard across all consumer products, aspirational imagery, lifestyle branding, the promise that buying this product will transform your life. It never did, but we kept believing it might. But TV dinners also taught resilience and adaptation. They fed families when time was short, when money was tight, when life was overwhelming. They weren't perfect, but they were something. For single parents, working mothers, exhausted students, and struggling families, TV dinners were lifelines, not luxuries. They represented survival, not failure. And that's worth acknowledging even as we critique their limitations. TV dinners prove that people could adapt to almost anything, could find ways to make do, could survive even when the systems around them demanded impossible things. That gritty, unglamorous resilience, eating rubbery turkey and calling it dinner, then getting up the next day and doing it again, is as much a part of the TV dinner story as the aluminum trays and frozen peas. TV dinners taught us about trade-offs and consequences. Every convenience has a cost. Every shortcut leaves something behind. We gained time but lost skills. We gained efficiency but lost connection. We gained consistency but lost variety. We gained freedom from the kitchen but lost the satisfaction of creation. TV dinners forced us to make those trades, often without realizing what we were giving up until it was too late. And once the trades were made, once the skills were lost and the rituals abandoned, going back became almost impossible. You can't unlearn convenience. You can't unknow that dinner can be ready in 4 minutes. TV dinners changed our baseline expectations, and those expectations shaped everything that came after. TV dinners are mostly gone now, replaced by evolved descendants that taste better and cost more. But their legacy remains. They taught us that speed matters more than quality, that convenience is worth any cost, and that dinner doesn't need to be sacred. Whether those lessons were worth learning is still an open question. But we learned them, and we can't unlearn them, no matter how much we might want to. TV dinners weren't just meals, they were messengers, carrying news about what modern life would become. And we ate that message, one aluminum tray at a time, until it became part of us, indistinguishable from who we are. So tonight, as you settle into your bed with its memory foam mattress, climate-controlled room, and refrigerator full of options just steps away, maybe take a moment to think about those aluminum trays, those compartmentalized rectangles of hope and disappointment that somehow convinced an entire nation that dinner could come from a factory, and that was fine, actually. That was progress. TV dinners didn't just change what Americans ate, they changed how we ate, when we ate, where we ate, and who we ate with. They replaced the dinner table with a TV tray, the home-cooked meal with a factory-produced facsimile, the shared family experience with individual, silent consumption. They promised freedom and delivered isolation. They promised convenience and delivered dependence. They promised the future and delivered something that tasted vaguely like turkey, if turkey had been processed through a machine that had forgotten what flavor was. But here's the thing, they also fed millions of people. They gave exhausted parents a break. They filled empty stomachs when time and money were scarce. They weren't perfect, but they were something, and sometimes something is all you have. TV dinners represented both the best and worst of American innovation, brilliant, efficient, democratic, and yet somehow deeply sad. They prove that we could engineer solutions to almost any problem, even if those solutions created new problems we hadn't anticipated. The TV dinner taught us that tradition could be sacrificed for speed, that quality could be traded for convenience, that family rituals could be replaced with individual efficiency, and once we learned those lessons, there was no unlearning them. We live in the world TV dinners helped create, a world of meal kits and food delivery apps, of eating at our desks and in our cars, of Instagram food photos that look nothing like what we actually consume. A world where dinner is often just fuel, consumed alone, while staring at screens. But we also live in a world that's fighting back. Farmers' markets and farm-to-table restaurants, slow food movements and cooking classes, people rediscovering that making food from scratch isn't just about nutrition, it's about connection, competence, and care. The pendulum is swinging slowly back toward the table, back toward the kitchen, back toward the idea that maybe, just maybe, dinner should be more than a transaction completed in 4 minutes while watching Netflix. TV dinners are mostly gone now, at least in their original form. The aluminum trays have been replaced by plastic containers. The simple turkey and peas combo has been replaced by globally inspired cuisine and dietary specialization. But the impulse remains, the desire for meals without effort, for dinner without commitment, for eating without thought. TV dinners may have evolved, but their spirit lives on in every frozen meal, every delivery order, every Tim we choose, convenience over connection. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, full from whatever you ate today, whether it was homemade, takeout, or microwaved from a plastic tray, remember the TV dinner. Remember the great turkey surplus of 1953. Remember Jerry Thomas and his airline tray inspiration. Remember the millions of American families gathered around their television sets, aluminum trays balanced on their laps, silently watching I Love Lucy while eating food that tasted like the future looked. Bright, promising, and a little bit disappointing. TV dinners changed America forever. They didn't just change what was in our freezers, they changed what was possible, what was acceptable, and what we were willing to sacrifice for the sake of saving time. They taught us that dinner didn't have to be sacred, that meals could be industrial, and that eating was just another task to be optimized and streamlined. Whether that was progress or decline depends on who you ask. But one thing is certain, we can't go back. The TV dinner opened a door, and once opened, it couldn't be closed. We walked through it, aluminum tray in hand, and we've been walking ever since, looking for something convenient enough to satisfy our schedules, but good enough to satisfy our souls. So thank the TV dinner tonight. Thank it for feeding a nation in a hurry. Thank it for teaching us that convenience has a cost. And thank it for reminding us decades later that maybe, just maybe, the things worth having are worth the effort. Because history may be full of shortcuts and frozen meals, but it's also proof that sometimes the fastest way forward leaves you hungry for something you can't microwave. Sleep well. And tomorrow, maybe consider cooking something from scratch. Not because you have to, but because you can. Because unlike your great-grandparents who heated up those first Swanson TV dinners in 1953, you know exactly what you're choosing and exactly what you're choosing to leave behind. Good night.